I still remember the day I first laid eyes on that unsettling doll, the one that would forever change the way I perceive the soft edges of twilight and the strange hush of old houses, because it was late on a gray Sunday afternoon when I wandered into a forgotten antique store near the edge of town, eager to distract myself from the grief of losing my grandmother, but entirely unaware that I was about to bring something far more sinister than a simple curiosity into my life, something that would echo through every corner of my home with cacophony of voices that defied explanation or sanity. I had been drawn to the store's dim interior by the faint hope of finding a small heirloom reminiscent of my grandmother's keepsakes, an object that could bridge the aching distance between my present mourning and her gentle presence that still lingered in my thoughts. And as I shuffled through the cramped aisles lit by a single flickering overhead bulb, I felt a strange chill that tugged at my senses, warning me that the hush in that place was not merely from disuse, but from a secret that had long been waiting to be discovered. The doll itself rested on a high shelf tucked away in the back, hidden behind a row of dusty porcelain figurines with chipped faces and forlorn expressions, and though I had no reason to pause, something in the doll's design, a pair of large glass eyes that seemed to watch me, even in the half-dark, compelled me to crane my neck and lift it from its lonely perch, curiosity swiftly morphing into mild unease as my fingertips brushed its worn velvet dress. It was unlike any doll I had ever encountered. Its body made of some lightweight composite that felt oddly warm to the touch, its face painted with an uncanny precision that gave it an almost human-like countenance, and even though I couldn't see anything overtly grotesque in its features, there was a disconcerting aspect to its gaze, as though behind those glass eyes lay a tangible awareness studying my every breath and deciding whether to welcome me or send me running. The shopkeeper, a frail old man with sunken cheeks and a voice so raspy it sounded as if he rarely spoke, sidled up to me in silence as I held the doll. And though he never once tried to sell me on any of his wares, I noticed his gaze flicker nervously to the object in my hands, as though trying to decide whether or not to warn me against taking it, a fleeting moment of hesitation that I foolishly dismissed as mere eccentricity. As I turned to place it back on the shelf, a hidden mechanism clicked inside the doll, releasing a soft but distinct whisper that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a ghostly voice that might have been a child's gentle coo or a breathy lament, and in my startled confusion, I nearly dropped it, my heart hammering in my chest as I realized the sound was too layered, almost like multiple voices speaking at once, and yet it was too faint to interpret clearly. Despite that unnerving moment, some stubborn part of me insisted that it was merely a wind-up toy or a battered relic with a malfunctioning voice box, so I asked the shopkeeper how much it cost, feeling a little foolish for wanting it all, but rationalizing that this bizarre antique could be the quirky item I was originally hoping to find, a talisman that, in its weirdness, might somehow distract me from the sadness of my grandmother's absence. The old man named a price so small it felt almost insulting to the doll's odd allure, and the entire time he rung me up, his withered hands trembling slightly, he refused to meet my eyes, mumbling something about disclaimers and final sales, warning me in a voice that struggled to be heard over the hum of a dusty fan that once you invite that thing in, it's yours for good, though in my impatience, I paid little attention to what I thought was the rambling of a superstitious relic. When I finally returned to my house, a quaint two-story home in an older neighborhood where the lawns were small and the fences tall, I placed the doll in a corner of my living room, more as a decorative curiosity than anything, and for the rest of that evening, I tried to focus on my usual routine, reheating leftovers, flipping through television channels, calling up old friends on the phone, all while studiously ignoring the nagging sensation that the atmosphere in the house felt heavier and distinctly watchful. It was late, near midnight, when I first heard the voices, faint, distant murmurs that drifted up from the living room, weaving themselves into the quiet so delicately that at first I thought it might be the wind brushing against the windows or some trick of my mind shaped by exhaustion. Yet when I crept down the stairs, heart pounding, I realized the doll was rocking slightly, as though an invisible hand were gently nudging it, emitting a series of hushed tones that reminded me of disembodied echoes from a forgotten conversation. My immediate instinct was to check if I had left a window open, letting in a draft that could move the doll or cause a hidden mechanism to engage, but every window was sealed tight, and the expression on the doll's painted face seemed subtly altered, as though the corners of its lips had shifted into a minuscule but knowing smirk, a detail so unsettling that my scalp prickled with an acute dread I struggled to suppress. Convincing myself it was just an overactive imagination coupled with the stress of my recent bereavement, I hurriedly shoved the doll into an old trunk in the hallway closet, hoping that by shutting it away from view, I could also seal away the bizarre sense of foreboding that clung to me like a static charge. But even with the trunk locked, I couldn't rid myself of the lingering echo of that murmur, a layered whisper that sounded both childlike and ancient, an impossible combination that wormed itself into my uneasy dreams. That night, my sleep was plagued by fitful tossing and turning, my dreams haunted by fleeting images of old houses, labyrinthine hallways, and the doll's unwavering gaze drifting out from dark corners, calling my name in voices that overlapped one another until they formed a suffocating choir of half-intelligible pleas, leaving me jolting awake in cold sweats and checking the clock every hour, convinced that I heard scuttling footsteps or faint giggles outside my bedroom door. In the morning, the rational part of my mind mounted a fierce defense, telling me that the entire experience could be explained by psychological stress, my personal vulnerabilities manifesting as auditory hallucinations, and I promised myself I would drop off the doll at a donation center, rid my home of its presence so thoroughly that no lingering echoes of last night's terror could possibly remain. Yet when I fetched the trunk key from my bedside table, I discovered the door of the hallway closet ajar, the trunk lid open, and the doll propped neatly on top, its head cocked to one side in what appeared to be quiet curiosity, as though it had somehow found its way out of confinement to greet me first thing in the morning, that same slight smirk tugging at the edges of its painted lips. My breath caught in my throat, and even though my fingers trembled, I snatched the doll with a sudden burst of anger, determined to end this bizarre chapter by driving straight to the donation center. But as I stepped onto my porch, the sky darkened ominously, thunder rumbling in the distance, and the previously still air whipped into a gust that snatched the doll from my hands, causing me to stumble and nearly drop it onto the concrete. Taking that thunder as a sign of an impending storm and haunted by the notion of the doll being damaged in the rain, an irrational concern, given that I wanted to dispose of it, I decided to hold off until the weather cleared, returning the doll to the living room table, its vacant eyes somehow radiating a sense of triumph that I didn't want to acknowledge, but couldn't entirely shake. Throughout the day, I found myself glancing at it from the corner of my eye, half expecting another whisper or subtle movement, yet it remained eerily silent, an unmoving sentinel with a quietly unnerving presence that seemed to fill every corner of the room, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for nightfall. By late afternoon, the storm intensified, rain hammering against the windows in merciless sheets, lightning illuminating the interior of my home in harsh, fleeting flashes, and each time the room blazed white. I swore I could see the doll's eyes shimmer with a reflective quality, like living pupils momentarily caught in the glare. An uncanny effect that set my nerves on edge until I decided to distract myself by cooking an elaborate dinner. While I was chopping vegetables, I heard a gentle chime from my phone, a close friend calling to check on me, so I hurried to the living room to grab it from the couch, only to find the doll tilted forward on the table, as though it had lurched a few inches closer in my absence, leaving me staring at it with a nauseating combination of disbelief and simmering fear, forcing me to wonder if I was losing my mind or if something truly unnatural was taking place right under my roof. During the phone conversation, my friend asked how I was coping with grief, if I needed company, or if I'd experienced anything unusual since my grandmother's passing. But I couldn't bring myself to describe the doll's situation without sounding unhinged, so I offered half-truths, telling them I felt anxious and jumpy, which wasn't a lie, and that perhaps I needed more sleep, which also felt accurate but didn't even begin to cover the scope of my dread. Later that evening, as the storm raged on, a power outage plunged the house into darkness, leaving me fumbling for candles and a flashlight, heart pounding in my chest at the sudden shift from the electric hum of modern comfort to a silence broken only by howling wind and thunder. And in that stifling blackness, I heard the doll's voice box engage again, but this time the sound was louder, a warped collage of voices that spoke my name repeatedly, each pronouncing it differently, as if pulled from the tongues of various individuals across time and space. I froze in place, candles sputtering in my hand, straining to discern words in the jumbled chorus, and for a split second, I thought I heard my grandmother's voice among the others, faint but unmistakable in its gentle lilt. The realization so piercing and surreal that tears welled in my eyes, torn between the longing for her presence and the absolute terror of hearing her voice emanating from that doll's twisted, mechanical mechanism. Driven by equal parts horror and desperate hope, I inched closer to the table, candle flame flickering across the doll's expressionless features, casting dancing shadows that made it appear as though its mouth moved in sync with the voices. And that's when the whispering crescendoed, culminating in a single unified directive that resonated through the living room. Listen. A command that nearly made me drop the candle as a dizzy wave of dread washed over me. Mustering what little courage I had left, I asked aloud in a trembling voice what it wanted from me, half expecting no reply and half expecting some demonic shriek. But the doll fell silent, offering no immediate explanation, leaving me alone with the echo of thunder and the frantic thud of my heart, consumed by the unsettling notion that I had inadvertently opened a door to something beyond human understanding. Unable to bear the tension in that dark, lifeless house, I scrambled to find a spare set of batteries for the flashlight, eventually succeeding in managing to coax the device into a weak beam, at which point I decided to search online for any information about dolls that repeated multiple voices or harbored strange histories, hoping to find some rational explanation, a miswired circuit, a historically documented haunting, or at worst, a cautionary anecdote that might guide me toward a solution. My shaky internet connection and the storm's interference made the search excruciatingly slow, but I pieced together scattered references to ventriloquist dolls of the 19th century and cursed objects rumored to capture the voices of the dead, each story more lurid than the last, peppered with warnings about unscrupulous mediums who trapped souls in inanimate figures, or tragedies that befell owners who dared to whisper their secrets to the dolls, only to have those secrets echoed back at the worst possible times. Though I consider myself a pragmatic individual, I couldn't ignore the parallels between these outlandish accounts and my own experiences, and when the lights finally flickered back on around 3 in the morning, I realized I had spent hours hunched in front of my laptop, riveted by tales of supernatural entrapment, heartbreak, and restless spirits, each one fueling the swirling dread that thickened in my gut like tar. Unable to shake the notion that the doll had allowed me to hear my grandmother's voice for a reason, I gathered my courage and approached it again, gently lifting it from the table and cradling it in my arms as if it were an actual child, feeling a wave of revulsion at the warmth that seemed to radiate from it, but forcing myself to maintain composure as I quietly asked if it could speak with her voice once more, even as the rational side of me screamed at how insane this all sounded. For a time, the doll remained limp and silent, its glass eyes reflecting my trembling face, but then it emitted a faint sound, like a deep inhale, and to my utter horror, the voice that spilled from its unmoving lips was a near-perfect recreation of my grandmother's final words, the one she had spoken on her deathbed when she squeezed my hand and told me how proud she was, that I should live free of regrets. Words that no one else in this world had been present to hear, which rattled me to my core and nearly caused me to drop the doll. My tears flowed freely then, torn between an overwhelming sorrow at reliving that moment and a sense of unholy wonder that some force I couldn't fathom had captured her voice, weaving it into the tapestry of so many others contained within the doll's depths, leaving me a trembling wreck who both yearned for more and dreaded what it might mean to continue conversing with such an abomination. Night after night, I found myself locked in a cycle of compulsion and revulsion, drawn to the possibility of hearing my grandmother's voice again, to glean perhaps one more shred of comfort from beyond the grave, even as I understood on an intellectual level that I was opening myself to something far darker, a presence that no doubt fed on my emotional vulnerability, using it to strengthen its hold on my psyche until I could barely recall what normal felt like. My job performance suffered, my relationships grew strained, and I started losing track of the hours, spending them hunched over the doll, coaxing it to repeat those cherished words, listening as other voices sometimes intruded, voices crying out in pain, laughter, pleas for help, or sinister mutterings that occasionally formed phrases too garbled to comprehend, but always underscored by a sense of malice or desperation that sent shivers through my spine. One evening, I decided enough was enough. I had to end this macabre obsession before it devoured me entirely, so I carried the doll to the backyard, rain pattering against my hood as I prepared to burn it in a small metal fire pit, heart pounding with the gravity of finally destroying the cursed thing that had latched onto my life. But as I held it over the flames, a whisper so anguished and pleading tore from its mechanism that my grip faltered, an impossibly desperate entreaty that sounded exactly like my grandmother crying, "Help me, please," until I nearly collapsed from shock. I recoiled, staggering backward with the doll still clutched in my arms, tears mingling with the rain on my cheeks, thoroughly unable to condemn the object to the flames when it mimicked my grandmother's voice begging for salvation, an act of emotional manipulation so precise it shattered my will, leaving me feeling like a traitor for even considering the notion that this cry was nothing but a hollow imitation used to toy with my feelings. Haunted by the possibility that a fragment of my grandmother's spirit truly resided within that doll, I retreated inside, dripping wet, leaving the fire pit unlit and the doll's velvety dress soaked, determined to uncover the truth of what lay within, though part of me suspected that no matter what explanation I found, it would never truly erase the nightmares that had by then taken root in my subconscious. That night, I dreamed of a sprawling attic filled with dusty old boxes, each one containing a doll with different eyes, different faces, and from each doll rose a chorus of voices that merged into a single, keening wail, beseeching me to set them free. And in the dream, I saw my own reflection in the glassy stares of the dolls, my features contorted by sorrow and shame, an unspoken warning of what might become of me if I allowed this obsession to continue. Waking in a cold sweat, I realized that I could no longer handle this alone, so I decided to visit an old friend who worked in academia, an expert in cultural anthropology with a special interest in folklore and paranormal legends, hoping beyond hope that she might provide a rational explanation, or at least a ritual or method to exorcise whatever presence was attached to this doll, though I dreaded the shame of admitting how deeply I'd fallen under its sway. When I arrived at her office, clutching the doll in a canvas bag to keep it concealed from curious onlookers, her reaction was immediate. A visible shudder and a quiet gasp as she felt an unexplainable wave of cold emanate from the bag. And when I cautiously set the doll on her desk, she regarded it with a mix of fascination and horror, as if she sensed on some instinctual level that the voices locked within it were more than just mechanical echoes, but rather shards of lost souls or echoes of spiritual energy trapped by an unknown process. Though her initial examination yielded no definitive answers, only a deeper sense of unease, she agreed to help me investigate its provenance, to trace any records of similar dolls rumored to capture voices from beyond, and in that moment of combined fear and determination, we formed a fragile alliance to unravel the secrets of the doll of many voices, unaware of just how far we would have to delve into ancient rites, local legends, and the darkest recesses of our own hearts to confront what truly lurked in that painted figure's silent grin, a path that would force us to confront not only external horrors, but the illusions and grief we carried within ourselves. I arrived at my friend's office with a heart weighed down by mounting fear and hope intermixed, steeling myself for her reaction as she peeled back the canvas bag to reveal that unsettling doll with its glass eyes and haunting presence. And though she tried to keep her scientific composure intact, I saw the flicker of alarm flash across her face, confirming that there was indeed something extraordinary and profoundly disturbing about this grotesquely captivating figure that I had unwittingly dragged into my life. I remember how the air in her cramped workspace seemed to drop in temperature the moment the doll was exposed, a cloying chill that settled over us like an unwelcome guest, heightening my already frazzled nerves and prompting her to switch on a small desk lamp as though she feared the fluorescent ceiling light would not be enough to keep the shadows at bay. She carefully circled the doll, leaning in to inspect every detail from its porcelain-smooth cheeks to the faint seams that ran along its limbs, and when she gently pressed on its chest and felt the disturbingly warm composite material beneath the velvet dress, her expression shifted from mere curiosity to a quiet horror that mirrored my own initial reaction upon first touching it. Despite the creeping dread that tightened my throat, I could not stop myself from spewing out the entire sequence of events. My grandmother's passing, the antique store with its dim lighting and silent proprietor, the whispered voices that intruded upon my lonely nights, and the moment I tried to burn the doll only to hear it cry out for help in my grandmother's voice. Each confession pushing me closer to tears while my friend listened with a mix of academic fascination and genuine concern for my mental well-being. She told me she had encountered countless legends and folktales about objects rumored to capture or echo the voices of the dead, some hailing from remote villages in Eastern Europe, others from remote corners of South America. But this was the first time she had come face to face with tangible artifact that appeared to embody precisely those eerie qualities, and her academic instincts warred with her personal intuition, which screamed that we might be stepping into realms of knowledge best left unexplored. Realizing I needed more than mere speculation, she rummaged through a bookshelf overflowing with anthropological texts, archaic references, and notebooks full of her own field research, finally extracting a slim volume bound in time-worn leather, which she gingerly placed in my hands, telling me it was a compilation of obscure funeral practices and superstitions regarding vocal vessels, or effigies believed to contain a living echo of the deceased. The pages of that musty book were peppered with archaic script and blurred photographs of bizarre dolls, carved effigies, and sculptures fashioned to house the voices of the departed, each story more unnerving than the last, citing examples of families driven mad by the incessant chattering of these objects or devout cults that worshipped them as conduits to the afterlife, believing they could relay prayers or messages to those who had passed on. One particularly chilling account described a 19th century medium who claimed she could capture the final utterances of dying souls and implant them into dolls or small wooden figurines, using a secret ritual that involved inscribing arcane symbols onto the figurine's interior, a practice that supposedly bound the essence of the voices to the physical form, ensuring they could never truly leave. My friend and I exchanged uneasy glances as we recognized parallels with my own doll, particularly the layered, multi-voiced aspect that seemed to suggest it contained echoes from numerous souls, each jostling for a chance to speak or be heard, and the question burned in my mind. Had someone performed an unholy ceremony on this doll, capturing not just one voice but an entire cacophony of spirits, including, against all logic, the very essence of my grandmother's final words? That night, We agreed it would be wise for me to stay at her place so we could keep the doll under observation in a relatively neutral environment. And though I felt a pang of guilt abandoning my home, the promise of having someone by my side, someone who wouldn't dismiss my experiences, was too precious to refuse, especially since the burden of hearing those voices alone each evening had nearly driven me to the brink of despair. Once we lugged the doll into her spare room, we set up a series of recording devices, digital voice recorders, and even an older tape machine in the hopes that if the doll started whispering again, we could capture and analyze the voices, perhaps even isolate them to figure out whether they were all echoes of the deceased or if something else, something far more malevolent, lurked among them. My friend, being meticulous in her research, also fashioned a rudimentary contraption using spare parts from an old stethoscope and a contact microphone, intending to monitor internal vibrations within the doll's body, in case the phenomenon stemmed from some mechanical anomaly rather than from anything supernatural, though we both suspected the explanation would prove far more sinister. The first night we slept uneasily in her apartment, checking the spare room every hour with apprehensive trepidation, only to find the doll unmoved, its large glass eyes fixed vacantly forward, a silent statue that gave no hint of the turmoil it had caused, almost as though it were mocking our vigilance by refusing to cooperate. At sunrise, however, we played back the recordings and found them rife with faint clicks, distortions, and at one point, a minute of static that rose to an eerie hum, a pulsating sound that crept into our ears and coiled in our stomachs with a primal dread, though we could not decipher words clearly, only the unsettling certainty that some presence had indeed manifested after we closed our eyes. Over the next few days, my friend dug deeper into her academic connections, reaching out to specialists in spiritual anthropology, historical occult practices, and even a linguistics professor who had once studied the phenomenon of xenoglossy, cases where individuals spontaneously speak languages they have never learned, hoping that if the doll's voices contained recognizable linguistic patterns, we might at least identify the origins of the spirits anchored to it. Meanwhile, I found myself facing a resurgence of vivid nightmares, each one haunted by the doll's presence, yet now woven with fleeting glimpses of other times, other faces, as if I were experiencing fragments of lives that did not belong to me, possibly those belonging to the voices trapped inside the doll, their memories bleeding into my subconscious whenever I let my guard down. Sometimes, I'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced that the doll was physically pressing on my chest like a malevolent child, arms braced against me, and though I would inevitably find it still tucked away in the spare room, the terror of that sensation lingered, making me question whether I was experiencing legitimate paranormal events or my own psyche fracturing under the weight of unrelenting fear. My friend tried her best to remain objective, reminding me that grief could manifest in uncanny ways, that we might be dealing with a highly suggestible state of mind amplified by superstition. But the more we recorded, the more we analyzed, the clearer it became that the doll was indeed producing bizarre vocal phenomena that defied any rational explanation, especially when, on the third night, her own voice appeared on a recording, repeating her name 3 times in a mocking tone, something she had never spoken aloud in the presence of the doll. Spooked by this newfound evidence of the doll's ability to imitate living individuals, my friend insisted we transfer our operation to a secure lab space at the university, away from the personal environment of her apartment, hoping the sterile atmosphere and advanced recording equipment might yield new insights, or at least offer us some psychological distance from the creeping sense of invasion that had begun to infect our daily lives. However, the more I tried to separate myself from the doll, the stronger its pull seemed to become, as though it had forged a psychic tether between us. Even in the quiet hours of the day when I was on campus or strolling through a park, I felt the presence of those watchful glass eyes, a sensation akin to invisible threads pulling at my consciousness, luring me back to that single ominous object. My appetite waned, my sleep cycle grew chaotic, and my concentration at work all but disintegrated. Worse yet, sometimes, as I drifted through the halls of the university, I heard faint snippets of conversation that no one else seemed to detect. A child crying, a man praying, a woman singing a lullaby in a language I didn't recognize, all merging into a ghostly chorus that followed me wherever I went. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of academic tests on the doll's vocal output, we decided to step out for coffee, leaving the doll in a sealed research room with cameras and motion sensors running, only to rush back in alarm when one of the lab assistants frantically called my friend, telling her the alarms are going off and that the doll was somehow toppling expensive equipment, even though no one else was in the room. When we returned, we found the lab in disarray, papers scattered, a heavy microphone stand toppled, and multiple readings on the sensors spiking into the red, suggesting sudden temperature fluctuations and electromagnetic anomalies, phenomena typically documented in alleged hauntings or poltergeist activities, but never in a controlled environment like this. Reviewing the security footage, we saw the doll sitting on a metal stool, motionless at first, Then the audio spiked, the cameras glitched, and for a few seconds the feed went dark, only to return showing the stand on the floor and the doll resting in the exact same position as though it had not moved an inch, yet somehow caused chaos in the room all the same. This incident was enough to make my friend question whether we were dealing with a mere vocal vessel or if the doll was actually a conduit for a far more powerful entity, a dark intelligence that fed on emotional energy and thrived in places where minds were open to possibility, capable of manipulating not just sound, but physical surroundings as well, an alarming prospect that heightened my sense of existential dread. My own emotional state deteriorated rapidly. I became convinced that the doll was whispering not just to me, but through me, as if sometimes it commandeered my thoughts, inserting fleeting images of sorrowful faces, cryptic symbols, or even violent outbursts of anger that felt utterly alien to my usual temperament, leading me to wonder if I was gradually being possessed by the cumulative anguish of the voices trapped within. In a desperate move, we consulted an old colleague of hers, a renowned expert in religious artifacts and exorcism rites, who admitted he had never witnessed a case quite like ours but was willing to attempt a cleansing ceremony he had learned from a remote monastic order, one designed to sever ties between malevolent objects and the living souls they latched onto, though he made no promises of success. The night he performed the ritual in a university chapel, I stood at a distance with my friend, arms wrapped around myself as we listened to him chant in a language so archaic it sent shivers across my skin, the doll propped on a wooden pedestal in the center of the marble floor, its eyes glinting under the candlelight like whetstones. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the chapel seemed to plummet. The flames of the candles flickered violently, and the voice I had come to dread emerged from the doll in a rumbling chorus that shook the pews, 1,000 tongues wailing, chanting, mocking the old priest's incantations until the sound crescendoed into a deafening roar and abruptly ceased, plunging the space into a silent gloom. For a heartbeat, I felt a rush of relief, convinced that the exorcism had worked, but then the doll's head jerked to the side, its mouth seemed to gape slightly, though it had no actual moving parts there, and the force of an invisible wave knocked the priest to his knees, extinguishing every candle in the chapel, the darkness broken only by the trembling glow of my friend's flashlight. When the lights came back on and the priest regained his footing, clutching the wooden pedestal for support, he declared that his right was insufficient to break the bond, that whatever lingered within the doll was too entwined with multiple energies, perhaps protected by an ancient or more complex rite that had twisted its purpose and rendered it impervious to a simple banishing. Crestfallen, we left the chapel with the doll tucked carefully in its canvas bag once again, our hopes of expelling the evil or reclaiming my grandmother's voice dashed, and though my friend tried to comfort me by promising we would find another method, I could feel the weight of the doll's hold on me deepening, as though each failure only strengthened its influence. That night, we scoured the internet and academic journals, searching for any mention of dolls that resisted exorcism attempts, eventually stumbling upon a scrap of folklore from a remote island in the Pacific, where villages told tales of the chatting idol, an artifact rumored to devour the voices of ancestors and spew them out at will, sowing confusion and madness in those who dared to claim it as their own. According to legend, the only way to free the trapped voices without destroying them, since destruction could lead to unleashing the full wrath of whatever malevolence lurked inside, was to perform a specialized ceremony that involved confronting the entity's keeper, a role that might fall upon the unwitting owner of the object, forcing them to willingly release not just their claims on the voices, but their emotional attachments as well. My friend theorized that perhaps my inability to relinquish the doll, fueled by that desperate hope to reconnect with my grandmother, was feeding the entity, granting it authority to remain anchored in our world, and that if I truly wanted to break its power, I would have to let go of all the pain and longing that had tethered me to the memory of her final words. Over the course of the following days, we carefully planned a makeshift version of this ancient ceremony, adapting what little we knew from the fragmented folklore and combining it with protective elements gleaned from various cultural traditions, including a circle of salt, a recitation of personal affirmations to sever emotional bonds, and the presence of a neutral witness, my friend, who would act as an anchor, ensuring I didn't succumb to the doll's manipulations in the process. On the designated night, we returned to the chapel's antechamber, unwilling to risk more property damage in the main sanctuary, and laid out the doll on a stone slab surrounded by candles, each flame casting flickering shadows across the walls, while I stood within a ring of salt, clutching a small keepsake photo of my grandmother that I had carried for solace. The ritual demanded that I speak directly to the voices within the doll, acknowledging my grief, my guilt, and my yearning to hear my grandmother's voice one last time, then consciously severing that desire, releasing it from my heart and mind, effectively denying the entity any leverage it had over my emotions. As I began to speak, tears welled up, my voice wavering with every word of farewell and acceptance, And though I felt silly or melodramatic at first, the charged atmosphere in that small room made it impossible to deny the reality of what was unfolding. The doll began to vibrate subtly, its eyes glinting with an otherworldly gleam, and the air soon filled with that familiar cacophony of layered whispers, voices swirling around me like a spectral tide. My friend stood by, lips quivering in silent prayers, while I forced myself to keep talking, to demand that the entity relinquish any piece of my grandmother's spirit it held captive, to release all the other souls trapped within its painted shell, and to leave me and any future victim in peace. The voices rose in pitch, forming a wave of anguished cries that tore at my eardrums, threatening to drive me mad. But I pressed on, repeating over and over that I would not listen, that I no longer needed to hear my grandmother's voice, that I understood her love transcended physical echoes, and that my clinging only caused more harm for both of us. The sudden hush fell over the room, broken only by my ragged breathing and the faint hiss of candle flames, and in that tenuous silence, the doll emitted one last whimper, a sound so heartbreakingly reminiscent of my grandmother's gentle timbre that I nearly caved, tears streaming down my cheeks, my entire body trembling under the weight of an impossible temptation. But I shut my eyes and let the tears flow, whispering a final goodbye before I cast the photograph of my grandmother onto the slab beside the doll, symbolically relinquishing the object's hold over me, though my heart felt as if it might shatter in that moment, torn between love and a crushing sense of duty to free us both. Something in the air cracked then, like a thunderous snap that echoed along the chapel's walls, and every candle blew out in an instant, plunging us into darkness punctuated only by the faint glow of moonlight through the high windows. Yet I sensed a presence lifting, a surge of energy rushing past us, dissipating into the night. When my friend managed to rekindle a single candle, we saw the doll lying motionless, its face no longer exuding that eerie warmth, its eyes dull and vacant. The eerie vibrations that once seemed to pulse through its form now replaced by a stark stillness that suggested the malevolent force had finally abandoned its shell. Exhausted, we collapsed to the floor, tears mingling with relief and sorrow, for though it seemed we had succeeded, I felt the sharp pang of irrevocable loss, the hollow certainty that I would never hear my grandmother's voice again, but also a liberating release from the cycle of despair that the doll had fed upon so hungrily. In the aftermath, we sealed the doll in a locked case lined with protective symbols and wards. My friend, always meticulous, insisted on storing it in university's restricted archives rather than risking my home or her apartment again, and while I felt uneasy about leaving it intact, a part of me reasoned that destroying it could risk unleashing the phenomenon once more. I spent the following weeks recovering from the ordeal, grappling with a bittersweet emptiness as I learned to carry my grandmother's memory in a more natural way, no longer chained to the unnatural echo of her final words, and each day the nightmares receded a little, replaced by a gradual acceptance of both her absence and my own enduring life. My friend compiled our findings into a classified research file, aware that some would dismiss it as fabrication or psychological delusion, but equally convinced that if we ever again encountered another such artifact, our knowledge might help contain it before it wrought havoc on someone's mind. Interestingly, the night terrors and auditory hallucinations soon vanished entirely, as though the presence that had dogged me was truly gone, and though sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I recalled the overlapping whispers, a persistent hush reassured me that I was at last free from their hold. Even so, I could not bring myself to delete the recordings we had gathered, nor could I forget the stolen glimpses of that intangible realm of voices, for they served as a sobering reminder of how strong our longing for the departed can become, how desperation can open doors to forces beyond our understanding, and how easily those forces can manipulate a fragile, grieving heart. Some days, I considered revisiting that antique store at the edge of town to confront the shopkeeper, to demand answers about where he acquired such a heinous object and why he sold it to me with such cryptic warnings. But a deeper fear kept me away, a suspicion that he might have more of those cursed trinkets tucked away, and I wanted no part in unleashing another nightmare. My friend and I, though bonded by this traumatic ordeal, drifted back into our separate lives, she to her academic pursuits and me to my healing process, but we stayed in touch more frequently now, exchanging the occasional phone call or text message just to reassure each other that neither of us was hearing voices or seeing the doll's glassy gaze lurking in the corners of our peripheral vision. In time, the memory of the doll receded into the background of my consciousness, overshadowed by the gentle glow of new beginnings and the slow, steady process of laying my grandmother's memory to rest in a place of love rather than desperation. Yet at odd moments, I'd see a child with a doll in their arms or pass a display of antique figurines, and I would feel my heart constrict with a flicker of panic, haunted by the knowledge of what can hide behind painted porcelain smiles. My friend, ever the researcher, once confided that she occasionally dreamt of 1,000 voices echoing through an endless hallway of locked doors, each door bearing a different face, and I understood her nightmares without asking for details, for we had waded through a liminal space between life and death, the known and the unknown, and returned forever changed. Eventually, I found myself rummaging through old photo albums of my grandmother, smiling through tears at her sweet expressions and the warm memories we shared, relieved that I no longer needed an unnatural medium to connect with her essence, for my recollections provided the comfort and closeness I once sought in the doll's haunting illusions. The lessons I took from that terrifying experience shaped how I navigated grief and the unknown in the future, an understanding that love transcends physical echoes, that the human heart can be both painfully fragile and stunningly resilient, and that sometimes our desperate need for contact beyond the veil can blind us to the lurking darkness that preys upon such yearning. Though part of me remained curious about the forces that animated the doll, I chose to direct that curiosity toward more positive avenues, occasionally volunteering at community grief counseling centers, sharing my experiences in oblique ways, never mentioning the doll directly, but hinting at how destructive it can be to refuse to let go when the time has come to release our loved ones. My friend, for her part, published a discreet paper in a niche academic journal discussing spiritual artifacts and the psychological intersections of grief, cautioning anyone who might stumble upon such an object to consider the emotional toll it exacts, and to remember that not all ghosts in this world wear sheets or dwell in the shadows. Sometimes, they reside in our deepest regrets and unspoken yearnings. Perhaps the greatest realization came in the quiet calm after the storm, when I recognized that my grandmother's memory lived within me all along, untethered to any external voice or doll, and that acceptance broke the last chain the entity had woven around my spirit, freeing me to move forward with both fond recollection and renewed hope for the future. Even with that liberation, the doll's existence remained a sobering reality, locked away in a high-security archive, far from prying eyes, an ominous artifact that might still hold echoes of the lost and the damned, silent yet potent in its dormant state, waiting for a reckless or desperate individual to unleash it once more. I prayed that no one else would ever open that sealed container, that the warnings we left scrawled all over the case and in the official records would deter even the most ardent thrill seekers. A small voice in the back of my mind reminded me how compelling the promise of hearing a lost loved one's voice can be, especially for those whose grief outweighs their caution. Months passed, and though the nightmares largely subsided, there were times I felt a phantom tug on my chest, as if the doll's distant awareness still recognized me, a faint echo that teased the edges of my dreams with half-formed whispers before fading into the silent darkness, leaving me clutching at the memory of my grandmother's comforting smile rather than the illusions conjured by that cursed object. Day by day, I learned to trust my own strength again, to reclaim the small joys of life that had once seemed overshadowed by sorrow and dread, whether it was the warmth of a morning cup of coffee, the laughter shared with a friend, or the serenity of a quiet walk through the park where the clouds scud across a brilliant blue sky, free of any looming shapes that mirrored the doll's silhouette. Perhaps in the end, that is the truest victory, the ability to live without constantly glancing over my shoulder, to speak my grandmother's name without hearing her voice echoed back in a distorted mockery, to sleep without dread of layered murmurs beckoning me into a labyrinth of despair, to simply be myself again, unburdened by the relic's dark magic. My friend and I, though forever changed, remain grateful that our combined resolve wrested us from the brink of madness, forging a deeper bond of trust and an unspoken vow to be vigilant against the siren song of objects that promise contact with the beyond, for we now know how easily hope can be twisted into torment. Even as I recount these events to you, I feel a faint quiver in my chest, recalling the nights I stared into those lifeless glass eyes, searching for solace yet inviting nightmares. And though I emerge from this chapter with scars, I embrace them as reminders of my own resilience, of the bonds I share with those who truly love me, and of the unstoppable power of acceptance in the face of loss. Through this ordeal, I discovered that not all tragedies come from outside forces. Often, our own hearts can betray us in the throes of grief, luring us to latch onto illusions, to discount reality, to surrender caution for a fleeting sense of reunion. And that is perhaps the doll's greatest weapon, the reflection of our own ache turned against us until we can no longer distinguish between longing and living nightmares. Yet now, I see the world with clearer eyes, balanced between logic and open-minded caution, unwilling to dismiss the possibility of forces beyond comprehension but equally determined never to sacrifice my emotional well-being to them again. For my grandmother's love lives on in my memories and the gentle influence she had on my life, unbound by any physical echo or mechanical contrivance. As for the doll itself, sealed within that archive, it remains an enigma, a testament to the lengths someone once went to harness the voices of the dead, or perhaps a vessel of unknown origin inhabited by an entity that thrives on sorrow. And though I have no desire to revisit it, I cannot help but wonder how many more like it lie scattered around the world, quietly waiting for the right mixture of grief and curiosity to activate their dreadful potential. Despite these lingering questions, I can finally breathe without the suffocating weight of fear. I can dream without jolting awake to echoing voices, and I can whisper my grandmother's name in a prayer of love rather than a plea for contact, knowing that the path of true healing does not require overshadowing the natural order of life and death with the horrifying illusions of a manipulative artifact. In time, I may speak publicly about this experience in a more metaphorical sense, cautioning others to tread carefully when coping with loss, to find solace in community, therapy, or simple human connection, rather than venturing into the treacherous realm of cursed objects and esoteric rituals. But for now, I cherish the relief that each sunrise brings. With each passing day, the memories of those haunted nights grow less overwhelming, replaced by a gentle reflection on the lessons learned and the resilience discovered, reminding me that even in the darkest corners of grief, we retain the power to break free, provided we can face our longing, conquer our fear, and accept that some doors must remain firmly closed. Though the Doll of Many Voices left a lasting imprint on my soul, it also taught me that there is no substitute for genuine love and remembrance, that no imitation, no matter how convincing, can truly replace the warmth of shared moments and sincere farewells. And it is in that realization that I ultimately found my peace, forging a new chapter of life unshackled from the haunting call of synthetic echoes. I decided that this final step in confronting the Doll of Many Voices had to be taken alone, for although my friend had been by my side through each harrowing ordeal, her scientific detachment and earnest support could only guide me so far before I needed to face my own demons unaccompanied, setting aside the academic instruments and protective talismans in favor of a more raw and personal resolution. I arrived at the restricted university archive in the late afternoon, my heart pounding in my chest as I walked down the hushed corridors lined with locked glass cases displaying ominous artifacts from around the world, each one bearing a label that warned of curses, malevolent spirits, or mysterious energies best left untouched, all testaments to the university's unspoken willingness to shelter items that defied ordinary explanation. Passing row after row of these silent exhibits, I tried to steel my resolve against the creeping sense of dread that threatened to buckle my knees, well aware that the Doll of Many Voices was the most dangerous item among them, not necessarily because of raw destructive power, but due to its insidious capacity to exploit a person's grief, longing, and emotional vulnerabilities. When I reached the final aisle, I spotted the black metal case marked with bright red warnings and archaic sigils, words that my friend had carefully etched into the steel in an effort to keep any residual malevolent influence sealed within. Reminders of the countless nights we spent studying cultural exorcism rites and spiritual barrier techniques in an attempt to contain that terrible force. My hand trembled slightly as I punched in the access code, hearing the mechanical click that signaled the case was now unlocked, and I exhaled shakily, remembering every whisper and echo that had once haunted my dreams. Every moment I had gazed into those cold glass eyes while trying to reconcile the hope of hearing my grandmother's voice again with the crushing dread that the doll's power thrived on my desperation. When I lifted the lid, a waft of stale air drifted out, carrying with it the faint smell of old velvet, dust, and something that reminded me oddly of static electricity, that tang of charged emptiness that always settled along my skin whenever the doll's presence stirred in the darkness. I could still recall the moment weeks earlier when I had stood in a dimly lit chapel circle, tears streaming down my cheeks as I uttered a final goodbye to the memories of my grandmother's last words, refusing to let the doll manipulate me any further, a painful but necessary rite that culminated in the abrupt dissipation of the doll's active malevolence. Even so, as I removed it from the cushion container and cradled it in my hands, I felt a subtle pang in my chest, not the overwhelming terror that once dominated my thoughts, but a kind of heavy sadness, as though I were revisiting a dark chapter of my life that still retained the power to stir regret and longing. For a moment, I was seized by the urge to walk away, to leave the doll locked in that gloom-ridden vault and never again see its painted features. Yet I knew I had come here with a purpose, to ensure that our story reached a true conclusion, free from the lingering uncertainties that might one day tempt me or anyone else to breach the seals in search of a final message from the beyond. Bracing myself for the possibility that the entity was merely dormant, I gently rotated the doll in my hands, studying its chipped paint and the faint scuffs on its cheeks, the small cracks in the glass eyes that once seemed so alive, and I quietly called out a greeting, half expecting to hear that layered chorus swirl from its unmoving lips, though only silence greeted me in return. This lack of response gave me a measure of hope that our combined efforts, the ceremony we performed in the antechamber, and the unwavering refusal to let the doll feed on my grief, had succeeded in draining its power, leaving behind nothing more than a hollow husk, an artifact stripped of the energies it once wielded so mercilessly. But I knew from reading countless cautionary tales that artifacts of this nature often retain some latent force, a spark that could ignite anew should the right or wrong person come along with a precise blend of sorrow and curiosity, which is why I had asked for one final chance to examine it, to see if there was a way to permanently sever any remaining ties. With a mixture of apprehension and determination, I removed the doll's velvet dress, exposing the composite body that had once pulsed with unnatural warmth, now feeling cool and oddly brittle beneath my fingertips, and I used a small flashlight to peer through the minute seams where I suspected the voice mechanism might be located, hoping to find some mark or symbol that could lead us to the final puzzle piece. Sure enough, engraved along the inner torso was a faint pattern of overlapping circles, lines, and spirals, not unlike the ritual diagrams my friend had shown me in the anthropological texts, reminiscent of the cryptic designs used to anchor wandering spirits inside physical vessels. And in that moment, I felt a dark spark of recognition. These were the same shapes that once haunted my nightmares, swirling across the floors of labyrinthine hallways and dreamscapes I had thought my imagination conjured. My heart raced as I studied the pattern, recalling how the old folktale from the remote island spoke of a keeper, symbol that locked the voices within, effectively weaving a contract between the living and the dead, and that only by physically breaking the pattern in a sacred manner could one release or dissolve the link. Given that we had tried exorcisms, protective wards, and even a self-cleansing rite, perhaps the missing piece was a hands-on approach, a direct but careful destruction of the original binding symbol, an act that would forcibly dislodge any lingering echoes from the doll and ensure they could no longer coalesce into a single entity. Yet I was terrified that by doing so, I might inadvertently free something more dangerous, unleashing a swirl of restless spirits upon the world or enabling the malevolence to anchor itself to me again. So I paused, closed my eyes, and let the memory of my grandmother's gentle voice soothe my fear, reminding me that my intentions were grounded in love and a desire for closure, not selfish longing. Gathering my courage, I placed the doll on a metal table in a private corner of the archive and laid out an assortment of tools, a small hammer, a chisel, a piece of chalk, and a jar of blessed water, items that my friend and I had determined might be necessary if this day ever came, though we never fully devised how we would use them. First, I traced over the engravings with chalk to highlight their shape, allowing me to study the precise lines and intersections. Then I dipped my fingertips in the blessed water, quietly reciting a simple cleansing verse I had learned from an old family prayer book, letting the water drip onto the doll's torso as I pressed my hand gently against it. A trembling started up in my fingers, not an external vibration but an internal shiver in my own body, a surge of nerves that threatened to overpower my resolve, and for a split second, I thought I heard the faintest whisper resonate in the back of my mind, a half-formed word that brushed against my consciousness before dissolving into the still air. Steeling myself, I picked up the small chisel and carefully lined it up against the central spiral of the engraved pattern, giving it a tentative tap with a hammer, flinching at the dull crack that followed, as if something much deeper than porcelain or composite had fractured in that instant. A wave of dizziness washed over me, an almost overwhelming sense of disorientation, and for several heartbeats, I felt my surroundings flicker, a sense that I wasn't just standing in the archive, but straddling some liminal space where the spiritual realm brushed against the physical, and in that blurred moment, I saw faces swirling before my eyes, old men, young children, crying women, some with terror etched into their features, others with longing or sorrow. Their lips moved, forming silent pleas I couldn't decipher, except for a single voice that broke through, a voice that managed to articulate my name with heartbreaking familiarity, though it no longer carried the same manipulative undertone as before. Instead, it sounded gentle, relieved, even grateful, and though I couldn't see my grandmother's face, I sensed her presence flicker in the periphery of that strange vision, bolstered by a surge of warmth in my chest, an emotional release that felt like a final goodbye and an unwavering acceptance. My resolve solidified, and I tapped the hammer again, more firmly this time, chipping away at the engraved lines until they were broken completely, leaving a ragged gap in the pattern that severed the spiral from its adjoining circles. The swirl of phantom faces receded, replaced by a profound stillness that made my ears ring in the silence, and I realized I was gasping for breath, tears streaming down my cheeks as though I'd run a marathon through my own memories, staggering under the weight of so many souls. I stepped back, uncertain what to expect next, half expecting the doll to crack open or unleash a shriek, but the object remained still, its eyes dull and lifeless, the chipped torso showing a crooked line where the chisel had punctured the carved design, as if the final lifeline tying it to its captive voices had been broken. Gently, I brushed away the shards of composite that fell onto the table and poured a few more drops of blessed water over the damaged engraving, murmuring a silent prayer for peace and release, imagining each spirit once bound within dispersing into the ether, free at last from the doll's parasitic hold. A final wave of exhaustion swept over me, the tension leaving my body in a sudden rush, and I sank into a nearby chair, letting relief, sorrow, and triumph mingle into a bittersweet emotional cocktail that made me sob softly for a minute, wiping my tears with shaky hands. In that moment, I understood that the bond was truly gone, that the doll's power had been severed from whatever dark rite once sustained it, and I felt no faint echoes or mental whispers beckoning me to hold it close, nor any sense of dread radiating from its inanimate shell. Before I left, I carefully placed the doll's remains, the chipped torso, the removed dress, and the jagged shards, back into the black metal case, layering them gently